Hello everyone and welcome back to Flying Through the Gyroplane Flying Handbook. In this video, we're going to continue our discussions from the 7th chapter on gyroplane emergencies. And in particular, we're going to talk about things that happen after you tried to take off. So we're going to start by talking about pilot-induced oscillations, or PIO. Sometimes we call this porpoising. And what is that? Normally, we're talking about these problems in the longitudinal axis, but they can occur also in the lateral axis. So what's going on? What's happening is that you're in this up and down oscillation, and it might look kind of like this. You're flying along and maybe you climb a little bit, and then you say, oh, well, I need to push forward on the stick because I'm climbing. Now remember that gyroplanes always have a little delay between a control input and the response. And that is something that can really bite an inexperienced gyroplane pilot. I always say slow, smooth, small. That's my mantra for flying any kind of rotorcraft. And honestly, you can apply that to fixed wing as well, and it'll keep you out of some troubles. So what happens is that you put in some forward stick and there's a delay, and then the gyro responds sort of at the top of your little path here, and now you have too much forward stick and you're coming down at a pretty good clip, and then you decide to pull up. And then once again, your gyro reacts slightly delayed, and now you have too much upstick, and that process just continues. So normally this is something that happens a lot in the case of the longitudinal axis with pitch control. And this can be exacerbated by things such as if you're flying an open cockpit machine, you might not have much for instrumentation, and it's hard to judge at first what does level look like. So what's the remedy for this situation? The remedy for this situation is pretty simple. Just slow it down. Slow it down. Stop trying to overcorrect. Remember, back in a previous video, we talk about things like pendicular action. And pendicular action means that your aircraft is essentially a little pendulum that's hanging from the pivot on the top of the rotor. So you can start oscillations. And if you start them at the wrong frequency, then it can get really, really bad. Other issues: buntover, sometimes called powered pushover. This is what happens if you remove that rotor force, if you unload the rotor. And what happens is you unloaded the rotor, and depending on your machine, it might try to pitch down. It might try to sort of pitch over or bunt over, if you will. If you have a machine where the center of gravity is below the thrust line from the propeller and you increase power, it's going to make this worse. And even if you don't increase the power, it could potentially make this worse because that thrust line again is above the center of gravity, and now it wants to go further nose down. And you can actually get into a situation that is not recoverable. So because of that, if you look here in the book, it'll tell you that you should use whatever the manufacturer says is the correct way to recover. So some aircraft will say immediately load the rotors. Those that have a high thrust line compared to the center of gravity will likely tell you immediately reduce power to not make it worse. Now, in both cases, they're probably going to tell you load up the rotor. When in doubt, load the rotor is sort of one of my rules when flying any kind of rotorcraft. If you're not sure what to do, pull back, load up that rotor. It's probably going to make the situation better. Some other emergencies they discuss ground resonance. And here's the thing about ground resonance. It doesn't occur in two-bladed semi-rigid rotor systems, which is universally what you're going to find for pretty much any gyro that you're likely to be flying. In fact, as we said before, if you are trying to fly under the light sport rules in the US, you have to have a two-bladed semi-rigid rotor system because anything else becomes not a light sport. So here's what happens. This is something you probably should know about it, and who knows? You might even have a question about it on your knowledge test. So if you have a fully articulated rotor system, so it's usually like a three-bladed system, as shown in this picture here, and you come into land and you hit the ground kind of hard and unevenly, what can happen is there are the lead lag hinges between the different rotors. And normally, if you got three rotors, they would be 120 degrees apart. But because you jarred it out of place, now they say this one is 116 from this one, and these are 122 from each other. So what's going to happen, it's like the unbalanced washing machine. The center of gravity of that rotor just shifted, and that thing's just going to wobble. And this can be very, very bad. If you go online, you can find videos of helicopters literally shaking themselves apart because of this problem. Then they talk about emergency approaches to landing. They do make the point that most modern gyros have very reliable power plants. Certainly if you're flying something like an AutoGyro or an Argon or a Magni or ELA, those are all going to use a nice, reliable Rotax engine. Of course, there are a lot of those older style gyros that might use something like, let's say, a Subaru engine, which, I don't mind a Subaru in my car. I drive a Subaru. It's great. But I will say this, the only time I've ever had an engine failure in an aircraft was behind a Subaru engine. So they're not necessarily as reliable for aviation use as, say, a Lycoming, a Continental, or a Rotax. Regardless, you could have a failure. Things always can fail. Thankfully, most gyroplanes are pretty basic. You might have a checklist, and of course, if you have an open cockpit machine, you probably don't. If you have a checklist and time permits, you can try to diagnose the situation. There's not a lot to check. But the most important thing is that you should start your emergency procedures. So what's the very first thing you want to do? You want to establish that best glide speed. And why is that? Because that gives you the most options. So they have a little picture here, and they say, hey, look, I'm trying to make it to this field. Well, if I come in at my best glide speed, I will make it. If I come in too fast or too slow, I'm not going to make it over my obstacles here. Remember, in a gyro, you can always come in high and then slow it down and do a steep descent as long as you recover consistent with your HV diagram, etc., and then land in that field. So there's no harm in establishing best glide immediately if this happens to you. Now, of course, unlike a helicopter, you don't have to transition into an auto rotation because you're always there. And that makes this a little bit easier and less stressful in a gyroplane as compared to a helicopter. Then finally, they talk about survival gear. Depending on your machine, you might not have any space for this, but if you have space for it, it's never a bad thing to have things like basic first aid, something that you could use for shelter, maybe a knife, in some way of trying to get help. For a lot of people, that would be a cell phone, but there are places in this country where those don't really work. So that's pretty much our 7th chapter here on gyroplane emergencies. Now let's go ahead and do a little bit of flying. Okay, for this video today, I'm going to go ahead and use the trusty Bensen gyrocopter. Okay, so let's see what happens if I maybe induce a little bit of pilot-induced oscillations. Again, open machine, there's not a lot of references, there's not a lot of instrumentation either. So I will try to kind of fly down the river here, and we'll see what happens if I get a little bit too crazy with my pitch adjustments. So it's probably kind of hard to see from this little video, but if you apply some input, there is a slight delay, and again, you have to account for that. So slow, smooth, small. That's the answer to this problem. All right, let's just see how well this machine does with a power pushover or buntover. I got the power out. I'm going to put power in. Notice when I put the power in on this machine, it immediately shoved the nose over. What if I put the power in and the nose is already shoved over? Let's see what happens. So that wasn't exactly a great situation, but I was able to recover in part by pulling the nose up. Now, I probably should have also taken some power out. So let's try that again with taking the power out. Little bit nicer recovery on that one. Okay, let's try a little power out landing in this Bensen. Now, I'll be honest, I actually don't know what the best glide speed is in this Bensen, and I do know it doesn't glide for nothing. It glides like a set of keys. All right, so I'm shooting for about 25 miles an hour here, coming down at a fairly good clip, getting past these trees. Starting to get close to the ground. Gonna give it a gentle turn, trying to keep it in an open area here. Keeping my speed up a little bit, and then I'm just gonna flare it, and I survived. And of course, the gyro doesn't require very much for a ground roll. So that's a nice advantage of the gyro if you did have an engine failure when you're away from the airport, is that you can put it in a very small spot. Now you're probably gonna have to trailer it out, but still, not a bad thing. Okay, just for fun, let's try some of this in our Cavalon. So we'll start with pilot-induced oscillations. So my nose is a little high. Let me push it down. Oh, that's too much. Let me pull back. And what you'll see is that it is a bit more stable than what you would have with that Bensen or something like an RAF 2000 that doesn't have a horizontal stabilizer, etc. Okay, what about a powered pushover? Is that a thing with this machine? Well, let's try it. I'm going to suddenly increase power and we'll see what happens. I got a very slight nose up, and that was about it. Okay, what if I'm in a nose low attitude? How do I recover? Well, in this case, I probably just want to load up that rotor first and then worry about the power. So the power doesn't really even matter in this machine. Now I want to do that one more time, and I just want you to notice what happens to the rotor RPM. When I unload the rotor RPM should go down just a little bit. So you can see the effects of loading and unloading the rotor. Okay, so what if I have an engine failure in my Cavalon? I can establish my best glide speed and see where I can land. So let's give that a shot. Let me establish that best glide. I'm looking around for a spot. Here's my best glide, about 70 miles an hour. Bringing it in. I'm going to go for this road here. Starting to get close to the ground. And I'm going to flare. I'm going to pull that stick all the way back. Like so. I survived. And now I'm on the road, so I can pull up my trailer and take my machine home. Well, that's all for this video. We'll see you in the next one.